Hi.
Hi.
Welcome to the next episode of the BRIO in the Box podcast. What are we talking about today?
Today is going to be episode 3 in our mental health podcast. We're getting into psychedelics.
We're going to talk about the future.
Yeah.
The future is the past.
That's right.
So to recap what we talked about in the first two, we spent episode 1 kind of exploring the current state of affairs. We talked about how the major tool of psychiatry being the SSRI antidepressant medications are not really working long term. The reality is they're just not helping people. The serotonin theory of depression really isn't it.
Yeah.
Major developments in the research have shown that that's not the thing, which is kind of explains why the SSRIs aren't helping people the way they were expected to, in the sense that depression is not simply a lack of serotonin in the brain. Serotonin is certainly an important part of mood and regulation, and it's an important neurotransmitter. So it's not to say that it doesn't matter at all. Mm-hmm. It's just a straight up simple lack of serotonin in the brain is not directly the problem. Yeah. So in the second one we talked about, I think we went back and counted, there was 33 different lifestyle tools that you have at your disposal that have been shown to move the needle in a positive direction in terms of improving mental health. And it's more like a system, right? Things have to work together. So on the one hand, we had mitochondrial health, right? The little powerhouses of the cell. There has to be the proper amount of energy there in the first place in order for the cells to carry out their function, to make the neurotransmitters, to send and receive the signals of the neurotransmitters. So that's where Chris Palmer's brain energy theory of mental health disorders fits in on the mitochondrial health side, and where the ketogenic diet works because it improves the mitochondria's ability to make ATP, to make energy, also stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis and creation of new mitochondria that function better. So we have the energetic side, the powerhouse. There has to be energy there to carry out the processes in the cells. And the processes of the cells need the right substrates in order to build neurotransmitters. So that's where the quality of the diet fits in, right? You need tryptophan to make serotonin. You need vitamin B6 in order to do that conversion. So that's where the quality of the diet fit in. We also touched briefly on the role of the gut microbiome. And that's again where the quality of the diet affects. There's a lot of stuff going on that's really not well understood of the interaction between the little microbes in your gut and the effect on your brain and how the two communicate with each other all the time. So we have the bioenergetics, the energy powerhouses of the cell. We have the processes that need the building materials to carry out their processes. And then today kind of fits in with like the sending and receiving of the signals between the cells.
Right.
So there can be serotonin being sent out, which is what's kind of happening with depression. It's there, but the signal is not being received. So it's like a receptor site problem. So it's kind of like you're trying to receive a call on your cell phone, and there's like static on the line, or the call's being dropped, or you can't hear what the other person is saying. Like they're trying to make the call, but the signal's not being received very well. And so this is where the psychedelics fit in.
Yeah.
So what the new treatment, the new thing where all of the research is headed, all of the major breakthroughs that are happening right now, the new treatments are actually old.
Yeah. And like ancient old. So psychedelics have been around for thousands of years. There's all kinds of societies and histories where you can see in like ancient pottery and old art and like cave drawings and stuff like that, where there's like little mushrooms and there's, shaman and ceremonies based around psilocybin or some sort of psychedelic.
Humans figured out that there are compounds in the plant world that interact with our brain, that are neuromodulators. All the way back to, like you said, literally thousands of years old. Practices in ancient Greece, they had the journey to Eleusis. Yeah. That was like 1600 BC. So we're like almost 4,000 years ago, 3,600 years ago. That was, they called them the mysteries. But there was almost certainly, now there's been some really interesting research about some of the pottery and things that were used at the time. The vessels, they would make wine, but they would put other compounds into the wine. Yeah. And now through, what do they call it? Archaeochemistry. It's like, they're taking little scrapings off of the pottery and doing like deep chemical analysis on what those things are. And they're finding that the compounds and plants that they were adding to the wine were psychedelics, were plant psychedelics.
Yeah. So it wasn't just wine, which was originally what they kind of thought. It was actually spiked wine.
Yeah. And I think all that stuff is super interesting, how far back it goes and what people understood and had figured out even well before the chemistry existed. There's a super interesting book called The Immortality Key by a guy named Brian Morescu that's all about the religion with no name.
Yeah.
It goes back and he spent 12 years researching and visiting these sites and pulling together all this different data on how far back the use of psychedelics go in sort of human, spiritual, and religious practices. Certainly there's a strong camp of people that advocate that the origins of religion were psychedelic experiences because they can have that very connected spiritual experience for people.
Yeah.
But that also that they were using it as sort of an annual pilgrimage in a way of like addressing their mental health basically back then, that it was like a spiritual cleansing kind of thing.
And it's not even like weird, obscure religions. It's like there's a good likelihood that Christianity originally had mushrooms as part of the process, and you know, ancient times kind of thing. When you look back at like old biblical things, there was like mushrooms, like there were sacramental and stuff. So it's a really interesting read if you're into that kind of
it's
history.
a long one. We listened to it on audiobook. Road trip one time. So that's an interesting one if you want to explore further into the ancient history of psychedelics.
Even the Salem witch trials, right? There's a theory now that these witches, if you will, were acting the way they were and thinking the way they were because of ergot poisoning. So ergot is a fungus that grows on grains. And because there wasn't perfectly safe storage things back then, they would often be eating or making bread from contaminated grains. And the ergot might have given them a bit of a like LSD type trip and made them think they were, you know, witches or experiencing something and
acting crazy, right? And
back then you weren't allowed to act crazy. Like, that wouldn't do.
The years of the Salem witch trials correlate strongly to an exceptionally damp, like high rainfall years. And ergot is this fungus, like you said, that grows on rye. So there's a strong possibility that it was ergot poisoning. Yeah. Ergot is lysergic acid, which is similar to LSD. Yeah. So people were tripping essentially on acid from their bread. So there's the possibility that it has that historical significance too in sort of the Middle Ages.
You don't see a lot of that bread in the grocery store.
So maybe don't cut the mold off your bread. I don't know.
Maybe.
So let's fast forward a little bit more towards like more modern history, like 20th century type stuff.
Yeah. So I think the best place to start is with a guy named Albert Hofmann, who, if you don't know who he is, he was a chemist that basically discovered LSD for the first time. And it was actually on April 19th, 1943, that he had the first ever LSD trip. And he took what he thought was a tiny amount of this substance that he had discovered. It was 250 micrograms. So whenever you take most medications, they're milligrams, which is like 1,000 micrograms. So he took what was supposed to be the tiniest amount, right? And ends up having a very strong reaction. And this poor guy knows nothing about psychedelics, right? And he gets on his bike to ride home and has this like ridiculous
wild trip.
Thinks
he's dying.
Thinks he's dying, but he's like at ease about it all. And he's like, okay, well, this is interesting. This is quite the experience. And of course he makes it through. And basically Bicycle Day is now the anniversary of that date. So all of the like, you know,
Psychonauts.
LSD, the psychonauts, the people that are into LSD like to celebrate Bicycle Day, April 19th. So that was 1943, and he foresaw that LSD would be like a really powerful psychiatric tool. And so he started sort of spreading around the information about this, and people started paying attention, and people started using it in different, you know, experiments and tests and stuff. And actually the military got their hands on it as well. And they were wondering if they could use it as like a warfare, you know, chemical. So they were hoping it would be like a truth serum or something that they could like spread out on the field and people would go crazy and they wouldn't be able to fight because they were just so out of their mind and everything. And so they started actually experimenting on their own soldiers with LSD. And the results were hilarious because there's actual footage of this from like way long time ago where they're giving these soldiers, you know, LSD and they're waiting for them to go crazy. And they just start giggling and like laughing and having a great time and like want nothing to do with fighting because they're having such a great time and they just feel love and they feel like connectedness and whatever. And so they're like, well, this clearly isn't going to work for what we were hoping. But that was actually the part of like the MK Ultra, which there have been a lot of like documentaries and talk about.
Yeah. Some people might be familiar with MK Ultra because the Unabomber was given LSD as a participant in MK Ultra. Yeah. And so some people think, and this is like the caveat to doing psychedelics, is that if you're prone to psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar, if you have like a family history or a vulnerability of psychosis, that psychedelics can trigger psychosis or schizophrenia. So
and we'll get into more of that later when we talk about the kind of like risks and whatever, but kind of an interesting little tidbit there.
Yeah, that the Unabomber was in on those experiments.
Yeah. So between like 1950 and 1965 was when the majority of the work was happening. So
basically, and it was like a heyday of research.
There was a ton of research going on using LSD specifically in psychiatric treatment. And they, over the span of 15 years, they tested about 40,000 patients. So a lot of people, thousands of papers were written, dozens of books were written. It was just like all of this, the research and science was going into like psychedelics. So it was really like the forefront of mental health treatment, and they were having really good results with it.
Yeah. Something I think is kind of interesting from a local perspective. So locally in Saskatchewan, a British expat named Humphrey Osmond moved to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and the Weyburn Mental Health Hospital was one of the world leading research centers in the use of LSD in the treatment of psychiatric disorders, but particularly in the treatment of addiction, alcoholism at the time. So little old Weyburn, Saskatchewan, the Weyburn Mental Health Hospital was where a huge chunk of this research was being done, which I think is so neat that it was nearby. So they were giving alcoholics LSD.
Yeah. And having really good success with it. They were having up to 50% of people just getting off of alcohol, which when you talk about any kind of other treatment, it's like not even close to that. So super effective with the treatment of alcoholism. They actually did an episode on Netflix. It's called How to Change Your Mind. And the episode on LSD covers more of that kind of stuff too.
And again, they have actual footage of the participants in the Weyburn Mental Health Hospital working through doing psychedelic assisted therapy and working through. But then we get to the mid 1960s.
Yeah.
So we have kind of like from 1950, 1965, the research is going great. The, tons of papers, tons of participants, lots of effectiveness. Yeah. And then we kind of get to the mid 60s and the backlash starts.
Yeah. So there's a guy named Timothy Leary, who is a Harvard psychiatrist, and he had, originally it was a psilocybin trip, and it was like life-changing for him. He was already a doctor of psychiatry, but he had this amazing life-changing experience, and soon after tried LSD, and he was like, okay, this is the future. Like, we need to bring this, not even just to like the psychiatric world, but like the world in general.
So this is like, the hippie 60s. This is the war in Vietnam. Yeah. There starts to be like kind of two separate fractions of society, right?
So he started encouraging everybody to try LSD, but then he also started being part of experiments at Harvard, and some of them were like kind of questionable in the ethics of it, So he started to get a lot of negative attention, both from the school and from the government, and eventually he was fired for what he was doing. But he kind of became this like counterculture icon, and he was just very anti-establishment. And at one point, the government said he was like public enemy number one, because he was basically telling people, stop listening to the government, start doing drugs. His whole big quote was turn on, tune in, and drop out, right? So it was like draft dodging and just not being part of the
war machine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that's, if people know about Timothy Leary, that's the Timothy Leary they're familiar with.
Yeah.
This guy's got the microphone and he's preaching to the masses of the hippie, anti-establishment, anti-war, and people forget that he was a Harvard psychiatrist first. And he kind of escaped out of the ivory tower and brought these drugs to the mainstream for better or for worse, right? So he was kind of public enemy number one as far as some people were concerned, but then he was also the guy really pushing that like, people should have access to these drugs and they should have the right to explore their own consciousness, and, that you could turn on, tune in, and drop out of regular society, or sort of the 50s era of everything being like very rigid. And, he was encouraging people to do lots more self-exploration. So there's, varying opinions on Timothy Leary out there.
Yeah. And so through all of this, obviously the media was a big part of it, and the government was like, hey, we need to do something about this. And so in 1968, LSD became a Schedule I drug. So real quickly, let's touch on like what scheduling of drugs means. A Schedule I drug has zero medical value. It has high harm potential. So it's basically just like banned entirely.
Yeah. No known medical application and high possibility of harm.
Yeah. And then Schedule II is going to be higher risk pharmaceutical type drugs that need to be heavily controlled, but they're still available. Schedule 3 is relatively safe for medical use and like commonly used.
Yeah, so Schedule 3 is like known medical application, but they're still controlled substances, so things you have to get through prescription.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny to consider the things that are Schedule 3.
Yeah.
Fentanyl, cocaine.
Yeah.
And then things that are Schedule 1, psilocybin, which if anyone's not clear is magic mushrooms.
Yeah.
People would, just so we're clear, that's the official name. LSD.
Yeah. Marijuana.
Cannabis until very recently and
Yeah.
still is in many places. In
Yeah.
the US, technically, it's still a Schedule 1
Yeah.
federally.
So basically they just banned LSD. So it's no longer allowed to be used in therapy or in science. And so the research continued. They kind of focused more on psilocybin and some of the other psychedelics because those weren't yet scheduled. And so it was still happening. And then in 1971, a few years later, is when Nixon started the whole real serious war on drugs. And so he kind of like banned all the stuff, right? Marijuana, psilocybin, mushrooms, all the drugs were now lumped in with LSD as Schedule 1, having no medical value whatsoever. Yeah. And it wasn't even just that they were scheduled, the severity of the crime greatly increased. So instead of being like, you might get a slap on the wrist if you have a little bit on you, it's like, you could go to jail, you could lose your medical license for even possessing this stuff. They really just hammered down on it. And so all of the vast majority of therapists, obviously they're not going to risk going to jail. So they basically just stopped the treatment altogether and the research as well.
We could probably do a whole episode of just ranting on the fallacies of the war on drugs and all the propaganda involved and the dark ages we've been all forced to live in the last 50 years. But the public messaging was that these drugs were super dangerous. This was public enemy number one. The war on drugs needed to happen to save people, basically.
Yeah.
But really, what was happening, like we said, you had this like pro-war machine kind of one side of society, and then you had the sort of peace and love hippies and pacifism and anti-war. And there's a quote on the record from John Ehrlichman, which was Nixon's domestic affairs aide. And he says, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, which also that's a whole other can of worms we could get into. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both of those things heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, we could break up their meetings and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Yeah. That's a direct quote on the record. Yeah. So this isn't some crackpot conspiracy theory. This is just actually the roots of the war on drugs were deeply racist and anti the hippies on the left, the anti-war.
It was basically controlling the population.
Yeah, and it was pushing their agenda and controlling the people. And if you really want a deep history of the war on drugs and you want to explore that further, the book there is called Chasing the Scream by
Johann Hari.
Johann Hari. That's a great book.
Really interesting. That's a good audiobook as well. He does a good job because he reads it himself and he does a good job. There's a lot of storytelling in that book.
He tells it from the perspective of different people involved in like the cartels and the street level dealers and the users and the DEA enforcement agents and all that kind of stuff. So
he also did an episode on Joe Rogan, if you're into that type of thing. And he basically summarizes the whole book in that podcast. So if you want just a quick version of it, that's a good source as well. Yeah. But super interesting and kind of alarming, all the stuff that happened and how much of a population control and how like racially driven the war on drugs really was. So
anyway,
war on drugs. We don't want to go too far down that road because
rant about that for a few hours.
Yeah. So basically like all drugs have been banned. Now psychedelic research is basically non-existent or has completely gone underground where there's little pockets here and there where they're still kind of doing it, but they're not talking about it. And it's certainly not available to the masses.
And like the research stops in terms of like controlled clinical trials and scientific papers being published in the literature. Yeah. So it's still happening, but it goes deeply underground and basically the research grinds to a halt.
Yeah. And so soon after that, another substance came on that wasn't banned because it was a relatively new one called MDMA. And
better known as ecstasy.
Yes. So Sasha Shulgin was the one who originally rediscovered it. It was first created back in 1912, but they couldn't really find any use for it. So they just shelved it.
It was patented, but then just kind of like shelved as they didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. It was like Merck Pharmaceuticals or something that owned the rights to it. So And nothing happened with it for decades. And then in 1976, Sasha Shulgin had kind of discovered it. So he was a really interesting person. He was a chemist, and he first tried mescaline back in the 1950s. And that sort of piqued his interest in psychedelic compounds. He was just blown away that these crazy little chemicals could make such significant changes in your brain chemistry.
Mescaline is a psychedelic from a cactus.
Yeah. So he worked for a company called Dow Chemical, and his claim to fame was that he basically invented a biodegradable pesticide and made Dow Chemical like a fortune, like really put them on the map. And so basically they were like, you know what, whatever you want to do, we'll pay for it. You're good to go. And so he was given a very high level access to like chemical supplies and basically had a free ride to just do whatever he wanted. And so he was super interested personally in psychoactive compounds. And so he started just experimenting with these different things. And it kind of got to the point where he was doing a lot of like kind of sketchy stuff within the lab. And so at one point, Dow was like, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't do this here, but like, we'll still fund whatever you want to do. And so he had this little acreage, and in this super cobweb filled, dirty, dusty little backyard shed, he had this amazing science lab. And he basically would like come up with little chemicals, and he would start by taking a teeny tiny amount to make sure it wasn't going to like make him sick or die. And then he'd take a little bit more and then a little bit more. And he'd kind of wait until he got to the point where he had figured out a threshold dose where he started to have some sort of effects. And then he would play around with dosages. Once he figured out what a reasonable, safe, and effective dose was, he had this group of friends that they would all try it together, and they would evaluate all these different chemicals. And he came up with like hundreds of these things. So at one point, he started sharing the MDMA with all of his friends, and they were all like, okay, there's something here. Like this one has some potential for sure. A bunch of his friends were psychiatrists. And so they were like, I think we can incorporate this into our therapy work.
Can we talk about what a crazy Wild West this was of chemists that would just cook stuff up in their lab and then just try it on themselves?
Yeah. And it's funny because that's what Hoffman had done years ago.
Well, that's what I
with
mean.
LSD.
Yeah, that was like standard back then. They would just try things.
And I remember reading Shulgin said, like, it was through Hoffman's discovery of how potent some of these things can be that he's like, I will start with 1 microgram, right? Like a fraction of a gram, and build from there, because LSD was so potent that like what was thought to be nothing ended up being like a very strong dose. So yeah, it is pretty
heroic
hilarious.
Dose. Sometimes those are referred to.
So basically MDMA had huge talk therapy potential. So they started using it as part of their psychiatric treatment and started having really good success. So that became the thing that was happening in the 80s.
And then it escapes the clinic.
Yeah, which, generally what happens is something comes out of science and then people use it medically for the first little while. And then other people are like, oh, this can be really fun too. And so people started bringing it into the nightclub scene. And that's when it became known as ecstasy. Mm-hmm. Actually, when it was first being used in psychiatry, it was called Atom. Mm-hmm. And then as it came out into the street drug scene, party scene, they called it ecstasy because it tends to make you feel ecstasy.
Yeah.
And so, basically as soon as anybody's having a good time, the DEA is like, wait a minute. No. And so the DEA started paying attention to what was going on with MDMA. Mm-hmm. And so that's when Rick Doblin comes into play. And he is an amazing person. We'll talk more about him, but basically he was part of the early years with psychotherapy using psychedelics. And after he tried psychedelics, he knew he was going to dedicate his life to it. He just didn't know how. He wasn't a therapist or anything.
Mm-hmm. He was in university at the time.
Yeah. But then when he realized what was going on with MDMA, he's like, oh, for sure the DEA is going to try to ban this as well. Mm-hmm. And so he started a nonprofit to bring the government to the court system and try to prevent them from making MDMA a Schedule I drug. He wanted it to be a Schedule III drug because there was such tremendous medical value.
And they wanted to continue to have research access to it.
Exactly.
They wanted to continue to explore its potential.
So he was fine. They were fine with it not being like a street drug, right? Like they didn't want it to be part of the party scene, but he knew there was medical value. Mm-hmm. And so he was fighting for it to be Schedule III. And they were actually winning the lawsuit. Like they were proving without a shadow of a doubt that there was tons of medical value and it should be a Schedule III, but the DEA basically just like brushed aside the whole legal system and just banned it anyways and made it a Schedule 1.
Yeah.
And so he was kind of left just like nothing he could do.
Yeah.
So it was 1984 that he was in that battle. And then it was in 1996, after it had been scheduled, that he created an organization called MAPS. So MAPS stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And that, to this day, is still going very strong. So they're fighting for the future of research on MDMA and other psychedelics from the political side.
So that's 1986. MAPS begins. And Rick Joblin stays dedicated to the cause. He knows in his heart of hearts that these chemicals can and will help people. And so he basically dedicates his life to going through the proper channels to make these things available for research and then bringing them to people. So he's an amazing dude. Like,
really
if this dude doesn't win a fucking Nobel Peace Prize for the unbelievable amount of like grit and determination he's had throughout his career. He's in his early 70s now. So he's like, all right, I need to fight the FDA. And he's like, how do I fight the FDA? He's like, I don't know. Oh, okay. I'll go get a PhD in public policy from Harvard.
Yeah.
He had done his undergrad and master's studies on psychedelics at a university in Florida. So he had done a bunch of research. He knew how effective this stuff was. He knew it was worth pursuing as his life's work. So he knows he needs to fight the FDA, doesn't really know how to go through all the government channels. He's like, all right, goes and gets a PhD from Harvard in public policy. And his PhD thesis basically becomes the roadmap for how to get a Schedule 1 drug legalized or turned into a Schedule 3.
Yeah.
So this roadmap that he lays out is what everyone is following now for MDMA. It's what made cannabis move from medical marijuana into legalized.
Yeah.
MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, cannabis. He basically wrote the roadmap on what everybody's doing.
And the journey, the battles he had to fight, he would follow to the T what you were supposed to do. And then they would change the way it worked.
Yeah.
And so he'd be like, okay.
All right.
And it would derail him for 3 or 5 years. And then he'd be like, okay. And he would like keep fighting. And then he'd make a little bit of progress. And again, they'd be like, oh no, actually with this, you have to do this. And they just kept like
moving the goalposts.
Yeah. But he just stuck with it. And the amount of ups and downs this guy has gone through in his career, it is mind blowing. So he is a super interesting guy to listen to. He's done podcast, like almost any popular podcast he's been on. He's been on Rogan. He's been on Tim Ferriss.
Lex Friedman.
Yeah, like all kinds of places. And he's got such a fascinating story that he's definitely worth checking out.
And he's just like a happy dude.
Yeah.
He's not bitter after being knocked down for 50 years of his career. He just is like dedicated to the cause and just seems so pure of heart that he just wants to help people.
Yeah.
Anyway, obviously I just love
Rick
Joblin. He's great.
So while he is fighting to get the ability just to do the studies, right? He's kind of taking care of the government side of things. Another guy named Roland Griffiths, who is part of Johns Hopkins University, he's the one who's credited with sort of reviving the interest in the actual science. And so he starts fighting to do the research on the actual drugs. And it was in 2006 that the first new or modern study on psilocybin began. And it showed, it took forever for them to get actually approved and actually able to do the study. But it showed such incredible effectiveness and safety that in 2018 that psychedelics were given breakthrough status and they were able to start actually like opening the gates to everybody that wanted to do the research.
It became much easier to get research approval.
Yeah.
So the first few studies, it was like
super hard.
3 to 5 years of jumping through hoops and getting approval to use and possess a Schedule 1 drug for research purposes.
Yeah.
It was like bonkers, all the red tape. And so now they get this breakthrough status, which definitely opens the door and makes it much easier to even conduct the research, because this was the loop they would get stuck in. The FDA would go, well, there's no research to show it's safe. But they'd put so many stupid regulations in place, you couldn't do any research. And then they would keep going like, well, show us the research. Like, we want to do the research, but you won't let us.
Yeah.
You know?
It's like an entry-level job that requires 4 years of experience.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? It's just...
So you have Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University. Like that's a major medical center, major center of research. He's also now in his 70s, been at this for a really long time. You have David Nutt over at Imperial College in London. And then you have the next generation that work with those two. So under Roland Griffiths, you had Matthew Johnson. So, you know, if you follow, he's been on Huberman and, you know, you may have seen him talking, he's kind of carrying the torch at Johns Hopkins. And then you have Robin Carhart Harris, who is at Imperial College London and is continuing to conduct the research on psilocybin and the treatment of major depression.
Yeah.
And Robin Carhart Harris recently just moved his lab to UCSF,
Right.
University of California, San Francisco. So yeah.
So now there's like, if you look it up, there's like hundreds of these studies that are currently going on. And all of these studies are very like, very time consuming and long, right? So it takes time to prove the science and get kind of any movement with the government.
Yeah.
But basically what the science is trying to currently do is prove to what people have known for years, and that something about this just works. Right?
They work.
They just work.
Humans have known this for 3,600 years, probably longer.
Yeah.
Science is now showing how or maybe why, but like they definitely work.
Yeah. So there's a lot of these different substances, and we're going to kind of focus on two main ones where most of the research is happening. And then we'll quickly touch on some of the other ones. But basically, psilocybin is the big one right now. The good thing about psilocybin is it can kind of like ride marijuana's coattails because it's just a mushroom, right? It comes from a mushroom, which is naturally occurring in the world. For whatever reason, if it grows on its own, people have an easier time dealing with it than if it's a chemical or something that was created in a lab.
Yeah.
So psilocybin basically comes from magic mushrooms, right? There's tons of different species of mushrooms that have psilocybin. But psilocybin itself isn't actually what makes the things happen, right? Your body converts it to psilocin, and that's what actually makes all the effects. But for ease of use, we're just going to call it psilocybin moving forward. So let's talk about, first of all, how well they work, okay? In these studies, these are all treatment-resistant patients. So they have tried 3 or more different types of interventions, and none of them have worked. Some of them, they've tried 20 different medications and all kinds of therapy. So these are like basically the worst of the worst when it comes to dealing with major depressive issues. They had one study that was a single treatment study, okay? So it had about 75 to 79 participants per group, and there's 3 different groups. There was a control group that did 1 milligram of psilocybin, and we'll talk about how dosing works later. There was another one that did 10 milligrams, and then there's another one that did 25 milligrams. So after the 3rd week, there was significant improvement across all of the groups, but the 25 milligram dose was way better than the 1, and the 10 wasn't that much better than the 1.
So there's a threshold.
So there's basically a threshold, and it has to be fairly high. So when we talk about milligrams of psilocybin, if you were to take about a gram of mushrooms, that gram of mushrooms is going to have, depending on the breed, like anywhere between 5 milligrams and like 15 or even 20 in some of the really strong ones. And often, like, you know, a fun dose that people will take just casually is like between 1 and maybe 2 grams of mushrooms. So you're probably getting somewhere in the range of 10 to maybe 15 or maybe 20 milligrams.
It's generally estimated, it's assumed that it's 10% concentration.
Yeah. So if you were to take 25 milligrams, that's closer to 2.5 grams of mushrooms, which is like a strong dose, but it's not a ridiculous dose. But then some of this research that was done previously are much higher. So they're looking at like 50 milligrams.
What's interesting about the psilocybin research is they always use the terminology high dose psilocybin. And for many, many pharmaceutical drugs, the recreational dose is much higher than the pharmaceutical dose. But psilocybin, it's kind of the other way around. The recreational dose is, like you said, often lower, and then the clinical dose that they're giving is higher. So I always think that's interesting with this, that they always specify high dose psilocybin, dose psilocybin.
So the 25 milligram group was the most effective. All of the groups had what would be considered adverse effects. And that's one of those words that scares people off, but they categorized a mild headache as an adverse effect. So there, of course, just like anything, there's going to be some like ups and downs, right? You might get nauseous, you might get a little dizzy afterwards or whatever. But generally every group, even the placebo group, had adverse effects. So this other one was a double treatment study. So they did 2 psilocybin treatments, and it was a much smaller one. This one was only 24 participants, but it really mimics what most of these studies have found. So this one was a good one to refer to. So they did 2 sessions 1 week apart. They had 11 hours of total treatment and therapy combined between the 2 sessions. So it's not that you just do the mushrooms. There's some therapy and there's some talk work with it afterwards. But out of this group, 60 to 75% had substantial positive relief. Okay. So like a significant difference, which is great, but that's kind of like a non-specific number. 2.5 times greater effectiveness than just therapy alone. So in a control group that was just therapy, there was 2.5 times more effectiveness when using the drugs. And then when you compare it to other types of pharmaceutical intervention, it was 4 times more effective than things like SSRIs and antidepressants. So 4 times more effective, 2 doses, not a lifetime of being on a drug, right? Is 2 doses of this drug with some talk therapy.
And the side effects, like you said, are like headache,
Yeah.
nausea, as opposed to all of the side effects that we listed with the antidepressants before, which is like weight gain and loss of sexual function and metabolic problems and all of, increased suicidal ideation, all the things that come with a typical pharma.
Right. So we'll talk a little bit more about like difficult trips and stuff, but the biggest thing that we get out of this is that a lot of the participants said this was one of the top 3 most profound experiences of their life. Some people rated it above the birth of their kids, like it was just like a life-changing experience, right? Which is pretty significant. So super effective, but like what's going on in there? Like how the heck does this work?
Yeah.
So I guess we'll start getting into the neuroscience type stuff. So we're going to try to explain it to the best as we can. But basically psilocybin is a tryptamine, okay? So tryptamines are also things like serotonin, melatonin, right? Things that are found in your body. Other drugs like LSD and DMT, those are all tryptamines, right? You've got a little bit more science background. So like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so a tryptamine is a derivative of tryptophan, right? We talked about the importance of the amino acid, the essential amino acid tryptophan. There are various versions of this chemical based on tryptophan where the carboxyl group has been removed.
Yeah.
And there's like 1,500 natural varieties of tryptamines in both plants and animals all throughout the kingdom of life.
Yeah. So basically, psilocybin is structurally very similar to serotonin. If you have 2 pictures of them side by side, that you can tell like how similar they are, even if you're not a chemist. They look very similar. In fact, if you're a chemist, you'd probably be able to pick out the differences a lot easier than if you weren't.
Yeah.
So serotonin, like you said, is a super important part of the human body. It's responsible for like tons of different processes all over the body. So serotonin has a ton of effects all over the body. There's basically serotonin receptors everywhere, and they all do all kinds of different things, right? They can affect mood regulation. They can affect your satiety. They can affect social interactions, pleasure, libido, sleep, digestion, like all kinds of different things.
And we noted before that actually only 5% of the serotonin in your body is in your brain.
Yeah.
95% of it is in your gut and signaling things in other places.
Yeah. So tons of stuff, tons of processes involved. When you take an SSRI, basically what it does is it tries to regulate the serotonin in your body, right? So it won't let a lot in, and then it will try to like make sure that enough is going in. But there's no real like rhyme or reason in where that serotonin is being affected, right? So it can cause changes in all different sorts of things, which is why you might have a whole bunch of side effects from taking an SSRI, right? You might be nauseous, or you might, have weight gain, or you might not be able to sleep or whatever. Psilocybin, because it mimics serotonin, has the ability to like actually connect with that receptor. And it has a very specific affinity to one specific type of receptor. It's called the serotonin 2A, or it's also called 5-HT2A receptor. And that one has some very specific neural changes. So instead of taking a drug and having it go all over the place so you can't control it, we know specifically where it's affecting things.
So like neurotransmitters and receptor sites are like a lock and key. And there can be lots of keys that fit the lock,
right?
If you want to think of it that way. So that's where we said there's like 1,500 different types of tryptamines, and some of them can fit the lock really, really, really well. So they call it like affinity. So psilocybin has a much stronger affinity for the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors than even serotonin itself.
Yeah.
So it activates. So when it like the key goes in the lock and turns the lock, it activates these receptors and then triggers their actions on the cells stronger than even serotonin itself. So it's like a super physiological activation of serotonin receptors.
Yeah. Super interesting. So the serotonin 2A receptor has a high concentration in the neocortex, and that includes the prefrontal cortex. And that is like a most recently evolved part of the brain.
Yeah. Neocortex literally means new. So it's like the layer of the brain that's most recently evolved. And it's kind of what separates human brain functioning, cognitive functioning from the rest of the animal kingdom, all of the amazing things humans are able to do.
Yeah. So it's kind of responsible for like understanding how to act in certain circumstances, right? You can differentiate between how you would act on a soccer game versus how you would act sitting in a living room having a conversation with your grandparents, right? Like those are two very different ways to act. Speech patterns, understanding context, sensation, perception, specifically like seeing and hearing are big ones. Mm-hmm. And then it's very high in the visual cortex. And this is why psychedelics cause such crazy visual disruption, is that it's really reacting with your visual cortex.
Mm-hmm. There's a high concentration of those 5-HT2A receptors on your visual cortex cells. So they get super activated, which is why you have the hallucinogenic visuals.
And a lot of people hear the stories of like, oh, you see like cartoon creatures running around and stuff. I'm like, no, that's not really how it works. But generally what happens is it's just like fractals and like drifting and like breathing and everything's kind of moving and stuff. And the problem is often people get so distracted with those visual disruptions that they can't really do the work of thinking and feeling. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of most of these studies, they'll have eye masks and headphones, and they'll put you in your own head to make you go through the process and do the thinking and
encourage the journey to go inward.
Exactly.
Certainly humans have used psychedelics for, connecting with music, and like nature is often a thing, and the visuals are part of the experience that some people are seeking. So, but we're talking about mental health and psychedelics in the psychiatric field. So we're going to focus more on how this is done in the research and in the lab for mental health benefits. So
the serotonin 2A receptor, super important in all of those pieces, especially visual cortex. So they tend to express on these things called pyramidal neurons, and pyramidal neurons are basically neurons that have these little dendrites, and they kind of like reach out into different parts of the brain to make connections between different parts of the brain. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you're making these weird and new neural pathways, and it can really help you connect different feelings and thoughts. And synesthesia is often really common. And you actually think you might even have synesthesia to some degree, which is like a common thing where you can smell colors, or you can like hear, whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't know all the different versions of it.
Synesthesia is a cross-linking of your senses. Mm-hmm. So and often people report this on psychedelic type trips where they're like, the colors have a taste, or, the colors have a sound, or like there's this cross-linking of your five senses. And
what happens is these new pathways, these neural pathways that are being created allow you to make changes in the way you think, or you react, or you feel. So you're basically like reconfiguring how your brain is working, which is super interesting. So there's no real concrete evidence on exactly why this is making an impact, but a lot of the thoughts around it have to do with your default mode network. Mm-hmm. Okay. So your default mode network, it's something that's functioning in a resting state. So if you're just laying down or casually walking and your brain is going, daydreaming, self-reflection, self-criticism, all that kind of stuff is part of the default mode network. And what happens is your brain is always trying to be conservative in the energy it's using, because the brain is very energy draining, right? Mm-hmm. We need a ton of energy to keep our brain going. And so as we age, we're trying to always build pathways that are just easy, right? So we start to make these habitual pathways through our life experiences. But the problem is the more you experience something in the same way, the more that pathway becomes constrained. And so often our reactions or our thoughts around certain things tend to become the default, hence the name, like default mode network. Mm-hmm. So if you're a fairly negative person, or you've had a lot of negative experiences in your life, you tend to associate negative things more frequently, and it becomes ingrained into your brain, and your negative thought loops become habitual. Mm-hmm. Okay. Psilocybin tends to quiet that whole system. So when we're really young, the default mode network hasn't really been built yet. So our minds are very plastic. It's said that psilocybin tends to increase your brain plasticity. Mm-hmm. And it brings us back to this childlike state of awe and wonder, where you're just curious and you're willing to think about things in a different way, and you can start to construct new pathways in how you're going to deal with your feelings and your thoughts and your emotions. Mm-hmm. So one or two of these treatments can have super lasting effects for up to 3 months long. So it's not that you just take the drugs and you're better. It's like the drugs just open up the possibility to start putting in the real work and rebuilding these neural pathways and changing the way you look at life or feel about things or react to certain situations.
People will describe it as like a ski hill, after lots of days, the ruts form in the ski hill. And then you need the groomer to come out and it smooths the ruts. Yep. And then you can reform the same ruts if you want to, if you don't do the work, or you can make new ruts.
Yeah.
And so the psychedelics, it's like the groomer on the ski hill, smooths over the ruts, gives you the opportunity to create new connections. So that term neural plasticity, people might be familiar with. I heard that tossed around. The plasticity of the brain is its ability to adapt and learn and do new things.
Yeah, it's kind of a push in the right direction, right? Like it'll give you the push that you need, but then there's still things that need to happen afterwards. Mm-hmm. So psilocybin seems to be about rewiring the brain, breaking apart negative thought loops. It makes it really good for dealing with depression and anxiety and other habitual problems, right? So some super interesting stuff with all of that. As far as harm potential goes, like obviously there's no such thing as like a free lunch, right? Like everything has a little bit of risk to it. But the best part about psychedelics is they're generally very safe, right? They're non-addictive, first of all. In fact, most people that do these crazy trips are often like, yeah, I don't want to do that again. It's often very difficult.
And speaking of addiction, another loop breaking use of psilocybin, besides the negative thought loops of depression and the anxious thought loops of anxiety, there's tons of research being done in the thought loops of addiction behavior. So alcoholism, quitting smoking, it's even being used in the treatment of anorexia nervosa, like habituated harmful behaviors, not just thought patterns, but behaviors as well.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you can use a drug to treat addiction to other drugs.
Yeah. So they're non-habit forming, they're non-addictive. As far as safety profile goes, it's basically impossible to overdose on psilocybin and even a lot of the other psychedelic drugs. There was a case where a person took, remember, LSD is dosed in micrograms. She took 55 milligrams. So that's 550 times a normal LSD dose because she thought it was cocaine. And so she snorted it and had a hell of a trip for sure, I'm sure.
You can have a bad time.
Yeah, I'm sure you can have a difficult or a crazy time.
But you won't die.
And the higher the dose, the stronger it's going to be. But this woman took 55 milligrams of LSD. And what's hilarious about this is she came out of it and her lifelong foot pain was gone, or she had like alleviated some of her pain symptoms.
That was the only long-term side effect was her foot pain was gone.
Yeah.
So they have something in pharmaceuticals called LD50, and that's the lethal dose 50, where 50% of the population, obviously this is always done in like mice and rats, that 50% of the people given this dose would die, the lethal dose for 50% of the population. And the difference between the therapeutic dose and the lethal dose is reported in multiples. So for something like Tylenol, it's 10.
Yeah.
The therapeutic dose of Tylenol and the lethal dose of Tylenol are very, very, very close, which, it's something we're all casual about and we just have in our medicine cabinets and maybe don't even put the lids on tight when the kids are around. And the number of people that go to ERs with Tylenol overdoses is quite high.
Yeah.
And then you have something that people are super panicky about, like LSD, and we don't even know what the LD50 is because apparently it's 550 times the normal dose and that's not it. Like this one case study, she didn't die.
Yeah. If you're eating mushrooms, you couldn't eat enough mushrooms to have any kind of death issue from it. For sure, you can have crazy effects and have a very difficult time. And people often get really like panicky or whatever on these drugs. They're not going to die. It's just they took too much. So, again, you can't really die from it. There's no real long-term negative side effects at all. You might have temporary ones like nausea or something like that, but nothing major. The big thing that you touched on earlier is there is a potential for activating a psychotic break in people that have severe mental disorders. But that can come from many things. That can come from marijuana. That can come from a traumatic experience. So it's not that people that have or potentially have those drugs can not do these things. It's just you can't do them casually on your own. You need to be in a medically supervised place so that if you do have one of those episodes, somebody's there to take care of you and make sure you're not going to hurt yourself or hurt other people. So generally, if you have a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia or bipolar, psychedelics aren't recommended. And as part of the studies that are going right now, they won't allow those people into the study.
That's an exclusionary criteria. So despite what the media would tell you. LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, they can't give you schizophrenia. They can't give you psychosis.
No.
But if you have a psychological vulnerability to those things, it can be a triggering experience.
Yeah.
And so often schizophrenia most commonly manifests between 18 and 25, early adulthood, in response to some kind of psychological stress. These can be distressing experiences for people as they work through some things. So the drugs can do it, but so can like the traumatic loss of a loved one, even just the stress of university.
Yeah.
That's often a time when schizophrenia first manifests.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's always the cautionary exclusion. If you have a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia or bipolar, it's not advised. Psychedelics are contraindicated.
Yeah. So we've alluded around this next thing, but I'm sure most people have heard about bad trips, right? Which are very much a thing. But the best way to consider those that I've heard is there's no such thing as a bad trip. There's only difficult trips, right? Really, anything can be learned by doing one of these experiences, right? And yeah, it might be super difficult to process some of the things that are coming at you. You're going to feel some reality. And often the people that are part of these studies have very difficult, crazy tears, and they're dealing with childhood trauma that they never realized was there, and like super, super difficult stuff. But if you can use that as a tool to get past it and move forward and clean that up, then that's not bad. That's great.
That's sort of what therapy is working through your difficult traumas and things from your past, right? Like therapy is difficult.
Yeah.
So one thing they always try to emphasize, they call it psychedelic therapy, and psychedelic dash therapy. Like they link the two words together. This is therapy. This is just psychedelic assisted therapy. You know,
Yeah.
This isn't, oh, we're taking shrooms and tripping in the woods
Yeah.
and then I feel great. Now I don't have depression. You're like,
Yeah.
no, you're using these things as a tool to work through the things you need to work through. And so yes, many people will describe these as not only some of the most profound experiences of their life, but some of the most difficult too.
And I think that the big thing about avoiding bad trips is safe setting and mental state, right? So if somebody's just doing it casually on their own, you have to have the right mindset that you're going to have a good time, and you have to be in a good, safe setting. But for people that are using this as a medical tool, your mindset needs to be, I'm going to do some work here, right? Yeah. So it's not like I'm just going to have some fun with my friends. I need to go into this being ready for some difficult things to happen. The important thing is the setting, having somebody supervising you to make sure that you're reassured when you're starting to feel panicky, and that you're safe and you're able to go through those feelings and thoughts. So
they'll keep you from running out into traffic or whatever.
Or just, help you get through it and help you explore what you're feeling and just, be part of the process. So
in all these studies, there's always two people, two scientists in the room, usually a psychiatrist and a psychologist, at least two people.
A male and a female.
Usually they try to, male and female.
And they just try to make it like a pleasant, calming sort of environment. They tend to make the music work with the timing of the drug. So it'll bring things up right in the peak, and then it'll calm things down as you come out of it. And there's this whole science behind the music on the trips. It's hilarious. Yeah. So like we said, tons of potential for dealing with depression, minimal harm potential, generally pretty safe. It's one of the safest drugs that there is. And there's a bunch of other uses as well. Like, it's not just for dealing with depression. A lot of people like it for creativity, right? Artists, musicians. Silicon Valley for a long time was like all about the microdosing. And there's never been any real concrete evidence that microdosing is anything more than a placebo effect. But
RCTs have been done on microdosing and it doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
So
but
if you think it does anything, it's only because you think it does
and
something.
The placebo effect is a powerful thing, right? And so if that's helping you, great.
Yeah.
It's been used very commonly in end-of-life therapy. So somebody that has terminal cancer and is going to die, there's just no doubt about it. They'll have one of these, and this is often where they do the 50 milligram, like the high dose ones. And it helps you become one with the universe, and you're more interconnected to what the value of life was, that you're just part of something bigger, and it helps you accept that you're not done. You're just kind of moving on, and a lot of interesting stuff going on with it.
End of life therapy research has been happening at Johns Hopkins under Roland Griffiths.
Yeah.
And they found that it obviously makes people make peace with the fact that they're dying, people with terminal illnesses, but it also reduces the amount of pain medication and anxiety medication that they need. So it allows them to be more present because they're not just drugged out of their mind in the final months or years of their life. So they make peace with things, and then they don't have to be cranked on opiates and anxiety meds and stuff. So it allows them to be more present.
Yeah. I think the powerful effects that a lot of people come out is just this connectedness, and even for a non-spiritual person, like a new understanding of spirituality, and maybe there's more to it than just going to my job day to day, and love, and just changing your view on the world. So there's a ton of possibilities with these drugs, and we're really just scratching the surface.
Yeah. And certainly, like we said, we know that they work.
Yeah.
It's not super clear why or how. There's a few things that are pretty well elucidated. That psilocybin docks to the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors. That's pretty well understood. That it's doing something to the default mode network. That's pretty well understood. But then there's other effects that they don't really know exactly why. It stimulates neurogenesis. The psilocybin stimulates neurogenesis, which is the creation of new neurons. So it's building new brain cells. New, fresh brain cells function better than old, kind of crusty ones, that have gotten old and crusty from who knows what. Stress disorders, alcohol, poor diet, take your pick, environmental toxins, things that poison your brain cells. Yeah. When neurons are too damaged, they can't recover themselves. You have to make new ones. And so it's interesting that the progression of mental disorders to Alzheimer's and dementia usually starts with depression and anxiety. So that's the early stages of things your brain cells are not functioning properly. And then if they get fully damaged, that becomes Alzheimer's and big chunks of your brain start to die essentially. Yeah. Something interesting about LSD, treatment with LSD cures cluster headaches. Cluster headaches are some of the most painful, debilitating, way worse than migraine headaches. And a dose of LSD can in some people lead to lifelong alleviation from cluster headaches. They don't have a fucking clue how that works, but they know it works. They don't know why. I know. And there's actually a derivative of LSD that is similar, but doesn't have the hallucinogenic effects that actually works better at curing cluster headaches than LSD itself. So it's not related to the visuals. It's not the hallucinogenic properties. It's something else. And they have no clue what.
They took the LSD molecule and plugged it into this AI computer and said, based on this chemical structure, how many other possibilities are there of chemicals that would be similar or have potential effects? And the computer came up with thousands of these things. So each one of those things could have a slightly different, effect on the body. So it's really again, we're just scratching the surface on all the potential stuff that's going on. I
think it's interesting. A lot of these psychedelics come from nature. Most of them come from nature. Yeah. LSD was synthesized in the lab. Albert Hofmann came up with it in the lab. And then they discovered after that chemical that he synthesized in the lab is basically what's in ergot. Yeah. Lysergic acid. It's basically the same thing. And so it's interesting that it was originated synthetic, but it actually did mimic something from nature. Yeah. And then, there's a bunch of other ones that come from nature besides just magic mushrooms.
Yeah. We'll just kind of quickly go through these other ones. There's research going on, but they're not the big ones right now. So ketamine's kind of been around for a while. Ketamine is already a Schedule 3 drug. It's called a psychedelic dissociative. So it's very safe in medical use in that nobody is allergic to it. And so if there's ever any kind of concern over allergies, they will use ketamine as an anesthesia. And that's traditionally been what it's used for.
So if somebody comes into the ER and they need to be put under anesthetic and they have no idea if they have any allergies to certain medications, ketamine's the safest one because it's the least likely to have allergic reactions.
They're currently using it to treat depression now. And actually, even in Saskatoon, there's ketamine therapy treatment places you can go to. And it's pretty interesting, really good, powerful effects as well. It's usually done through IV, and then there's talk therapy as well. But for the first 3 weeks, they'll usually do 2 infusions a week, and you have a 20-minute dissociative kind of journey that you go on, and then they talk through it afterwards. And then they'll do weekly treatments for 3 weeks. And then often after 6 weeks, that's it. You're good to go. Yeah. Some people will need a bit of a booster dose here and there, but often patients just never return again after 6 weeks because it just fixes their depression. And there's some stories of some seriously bad depressive people that are cured through ketamine. It's pretty amazing stuff. Yeah. And that one, again, it's already being used, right? You can do it locally.
And that's why, because it was already a Schedule 3, it was much easier to conduct research with ketamine and show that it was effective. Yeah. Because you didn't have to jump through half a decade of hoops to get approval to do it in the first place. So that's where the importance of the scheduling of these drugs really comes into play so that the science can proceed.
Yeah. So these next ones are fairly naturally occurring ones as well. Ibogaine was kind of originally discovered from a root in Africa. It's been used very well with substance abuse treatment. So you can go down to Mexico or other places in South America to have Ibogaine therapy. This one is not a fun one. Yeah. This one has very tremendous amounts of projectile vomiting, very uncomfortable feelings, and it's a real long experience. And apparently it's just brutal, but it's so good at curing addiction, especially opioid addiction, which is one of the hardest ones to get off of. So tons of promising stuff there.
A violent purging, people describe it. The trip, it can be 12 hours or longer. Yeah. Not fun, but it's just a symbolic release of all of the stuff that people needed to let go of. And yeah, super effective. There's no Ibogaine clinics in Canada or the US, but there are in Mexico. So that's a frequent thing that people will go down for Ibogaine treatment south of the border.
We kind of talked about this earlier. So peyote, which is a type of cactus, and then San Pedro cactus as well. Those are both mescaline containing cacti, and they've been around forever. But their big thing right now is they've been adopted, like not originated by, but adopted by Aboriginals. So there's what's it called?
The Native American Church,
who has been given government permission to use it as part of their ceremonies. And it's the only drug that has different legalities based on if you're part of this church or not, which is kind of a weird thing. It's not even if you're Aboriginal or not, you have to be part of this church.
Yeah.
So this one has been used by them for trauma recovery, substance abuse, even just part of spirituality, right? The big problem with this one is the concerns, because it's starting to get more and more popular. There's concerns over overuse. The peyote cactus takes 10 years to mature. So to grow it is not like, we'll just grow it next year, we'll be good to go. It's like it takes 10 years to fully mature. And so there's concerns over it becoming more mainstream, that there's not going to be enough left for everybody. The good thing is that you can get synthetic mescaline quite easily. There's just always the people out there that are like, no, you got to have the real mushrooms, not the chemical structure. It's like, it's the same thing.
Yeah. The chemical is the chemical. It doesn't matter where you got it from.
Yeah. And honestly, after all the shit that Aboriginal people have been through, if we just decide that they get to have all the peyote in the world stuff, then that's fine. I think at the very least we can agree to that.
The other one's ayahuasca.
Yeah.
People have heard maybe of like an ayahuasca trip.
This one's become a whole vacation thing.
Yeah. Spiritual and borderline religious, ceremonial, cultural practices in South America.
Yeah.
Ayahuasca is a plant that contains DMT. DMT is a naturally occurring chemical in your brain.
Yeah. DMT's
dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah, dimethyltryptamine. Yeah. There's like thousands of plants that have it. Again, DMT is found in our brain. It's a super interesting one. When you want to take DMT, it's not orally available. I can't imagine being a tribes person back in the day that figured this out.
Yeah.
But there's certain plants that have an MAOI inhibitor. MAO is just another process in our brain that helps us break down certain types of hormones and stuff.
Monoamine oxidase.
Yeah. So if you take a plant containing DMT and mix it with a plant containing an MAOI, it all of a sudden makes it bioavailable or orally available. And so you can consume it, and they'll have these ceremonies with ayahuasca. Another one that's often very uncomfortable, often lots of throwing up, but it's really good for like substance abuse, depression, and general self-improvement. People will go on these ayahuasca retreats to make themselves a better person. So that's become quite a commercial thing, which a lot of people are angry about.
Yeah. Yeah. People don't love that for sure.
Yeah. And then like DMT specifically is just a drug you can take as well. People generally smoke it. And this is a super short, but very potent one. You'll hear people that have done it talk about just blasting off into this different realm or different universe. So it can be like 5 to 15 minutes, but it's one of the most intense trips you can have. And it's common for seeing crazy visions and interacting with different entities, learning really powerful life lessons and stuff. It's very visual, very potent stuff. And then...
But very short-lived.
Super
like
short-lived.
People will get blasted off in outer space, and then they're back in like 5 or 10 minutes, and they're like, oh my God.
And like crazy time distortions where somebody will blast off and they'll be like, I was gone for years. And they're like, that was like 10 minutes, dude. Like, and pretty crazy one. And then a very similar one as well that's found in nature is called 5-MeO-DMT. So this one's like toad venom is where it's naturally found. Same sort of idea. It's even more potent than DMT, but this one, it's like, it's less about seeing things and it's more just like a whiteout. So people will say, you see nothing and you are just in it with your thoughts and your feelings. And it's like, again, super potent, very common to have powerful ego death type experiences with this one, but it's less of a visual one and more of just an introspective kind of thing.
Yeah. Ego death is something people describe often from these psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
And it is from the quieting of the default mode network, and your sort of sense of self gets put to the side. And that's why people come away from these experiences with a much more like connectedness. And people interpret that connectedness in a variety of ways. Some people take it as a very religious experience. They feel connected to a higher power. Some people feel just more connected to other humans and to, you know, humanity and animals and the earth and just sort of the universe, you know, more of a spiritual, less religious kind of perspective.
Yep.
Some people just come out of it less circling on their own shit, right? And just like, I'm just part of it and we're all going through it. And you come out with a sense of empathy and for yourself and for other people, and maybe for the people that have harmed you, and, so people can interpret or get a variety of benefits out of ego death.
Yeah. So those are all things that are like being researched and tons of potential in different areas. But the one we're going to finish on is, again, probably one of the biggest ones. I'd say psilocybin and MDMA are the two big ones.
Mm-hmm. So the other ones are what they call classic psychedelics.
Yeah.
And MDMA is not a psychedelic, but it's getting lumped in.
It is,
with the psychedelics. Yeah.
So MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. So it is an amphetamine drug, but it's such an interesting, unique one that they came up with their own term for this drug specifically. They called it an empathogen, which we'll get to later.
So it's not a tryptamine like the others. It's an amphetamine.
It's an amphetamine. So basically, mushrooms mimic serotonin and cause interactions with the 5-HT2A receptor.
Psilocybin docks on the receptors.
Yeah. MDMA stimulates the release of your serotonin along with norepinephrine, a little bit of dopamine, a little bit of oxytocin, and it inhibits the reuptake of them as well. So it releases your body's own serotonin primarily. Mm-hmm. That serotonin will, again, affect those receptors and cause things to happen within your body. Mm-hmm. So it works similar to psilocybin, it's just different.
So where psilocybin has such a high affinity for those 2A receptors that it causes like a super physiological activation, which is why you get the visuals and the visual cortex and that sort of thing. MDMA does not dock to the receptors at all. It stimulates the release of your own chemicals. So you get a physiological activation with your own serotonin of those things. So MDMA does not have any psychedelic effects. It doesn't come with any visuals or hallucinogens or anything like psilocybin and LSD and the other classic psychedelics do.
Yeah. So basically, instead of giving you the visual kind of trip, it has some other effects. The main thing they think that it does is it quiets your amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of like the fear center of your brain. Mm-hmm. And often when somebody has a traumatizing experience, they develop a pathway of fear around that thing. Mm-hmm. And so anytime they try to deal with it or think about it, they're just terrified and they can't process it, right?
Can't go there.
So MDMA will decrease feelings of fear and defensiveness. And then it also increases feelings of well-being, right? Which is why it's such a commonly used drug.
And that's serotonin, right? They call them your here and nows, your contentment.
Yeah. It increases your sociability and extroversion. So it makes you want to talk to people and it makes you more outgoing and stuff.
That's the dopamine and norepinephrine effect.
Yeah. It increases interpersonal trust. Anybody that's ever done MDMA knows you can make best friends immediately with a perfect stranger.
And that's the oxytocin. Oxytocin's your love and bonding hormone.
Because it's an amphetamine, it increases your state of consciousness. You're much more alert, right? It's definitely a bit of a stimulant as well. Mm-hmm. But the big thing is it just increases bonding, right? Hence the name empathogen, right? You're just more empathetic. You're more likely to bond with people and just feel a connectedness amongst other people. And so all of these things make it the perfect drug for talk therapy, right? For psychotherapy. So a lot of the people that are using this drug will basically say they can do 5 years worth of therapy in their 3 sessions that they have with their person, because so much of psychotherapy is just building trust and trying to get them to open up. And that can take a whole year. They can do that immediately with the drug.
Deconditioning the fear response of addressing the roots of your traumas.
And so they take these drugs and all those walls come crumbling down and they're just way more willing to actually talk and put in the work.
So where psilocybin, the psychedelic therapy sessions are often eye shades and earphones on, and there's very little actual talking happening during the session. Yeah. And in which case it works, like we said, for internally exploring your own loops, whether it's depression, anxiety, and the roots of those things, or addictive behaviors, or harmful behaviors. MDMA, most of the research is done in PTSD. Yeah. So talk therapy. So the sessions are, you're awake, you're alert, you're talking with your therapist the whole time, and it's helping you process your trauma by putting you in they call it the love drug, right? So it puts you in a content state of warm fuzzies and love, reduces the fear, makes you feel safe, and it allows you to go to those places that you need to process and deal with them and let them go. Like you said, just in a greatly accelerated fashion, what would take 5 or 10 years of therapy can be done in 3 sessions.
And it's extremely effective. And honestly, I can attest to this personally, because when I was dealing with the loss of my brother, I used MDMA to help with that process, and it made a significant difference. And it's one of those things that just it makes magic happen, it's incredible, the effects. Here's some of the studies that they're doing right now. It is like bananas, the numbers they're coming. So this is the most recent phase 3 study that MAPS has done. 88% of participants, and by the way, these are all, again, the worst of the worst. These are the most treatment resistant, highest level of PTSD people. So like really, really difficult situations.
They have tried everything else.
Yes, everything else. So they had 88% of participants with severe treatment-resistant PTSD experience a clinically significant reduction in PTSD diagnostic scores 2 months after their third session. So they do 3 sessions, 1 month apart. It's usually about an 8-hour session where they do the trip and then talk a whole bunch afterwards. And then there's therapy sessions that aren't on MDMA as well. It's usually about 12 sessions altogether that they do.
They call it reintegration.
Yeah. So 3 sessions, 1 month apart. And then with that same thing with the placebo group, 60% of participants had improvements, right? Which is still significant. So it really goes to show that it's not just the drug. Like the therapy is great, but going from 60% to 88%, like that's pretty good. Mm-hmm. But here's where the real kicker is. 67% of participants in the MDMA group no longer met the criteria for PTSD 2 months after the sessions, which means they were basically cured, right? Yeah. They were no longer in the PTSD group. Yeah. 67%. The placebo group was only 32% of people. Yeah. So more than twice as effective of curing this like horrible, horrible condition.
So a few takeaways from that. The therapy that MAPS does alone is decently effective in that, like you said, these are treatment-resistant people that have tried everything else and nothing worked. So therapy alone, they can get 32% of people to no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. People are always hesitant about using the word cure, right? Yeah. But you're like, they can't diagnose them with PTSD anymore. But even more remarkable is they can get 2/3 of the treatment-resistant PTSD people. These are people that are suffering and have tried everything else and are borderline suicidal because they can't tolerate living like this anymore. They can get 2/3 of them to no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Amazing. It is bonkers.
Yeah. And this, like you said, this is the worst of the worst, right? So if it's working for them, like how effective is it going to be for the general population? I'll call them the people that are like dealing with some trauma and stuff, but it's not like severe. So pretty impressive. They're hoping that by sometime in 2024, it'll be scheduled as a Schedule 3 drug. They're really close. They've done all of the, they've gone through all the hurdles and jumps, and they've done all the studies and stuff. They're still looking for funding to kind of get things further pushed along, but they're really hoping that sometime in 2024 it'll be.
Yeah, they were kind of aiming for end of 2023, hoping for early 2024. So this is Rick Doblin, head of MAPS.
Yeah.
MAPS has funded all of this research independently. So MAPS is a nonprofit organization, and they have fundraised through like donations and philanthropy 100% of this research. Yep. The government, so like the NIH in the US, has not helped 1 single cent in bringing these very, very effective treatments to market for people. They made them do all of this privately. And so luckily there are major philanthropic supporters of this cause. And often how this happens is like a personal conversion experience. Like people, wealthy, millionaires, billionaires, whatever, have themselves or someone in their family that is suffering from PTSD or treatment-resistant depression, and the typical things aren't helping. And they're like, I have all this money, but I can't bring my son back or my daughter back or whatever. And they're like, what else is out there? And they find these treatments and they find these researchers and they go, why the fuck aren't we funding this? And they put their personal money behind the cause, right? So it's unfortunate that it takes people being affected by these things personally for them to take up the cause and push this forward so that everybody can benefit from it.
Yeah. The difficult thing about all these studies is they're very expensive, and generally they're paid for by like pharma, right? But MDMA can't be owned by anybody. It's
off patent.
Way off patent. And so there's no money to be made. And so and then again, one of the like most profitable drugs in the world are antidepressants. So if you're going to cure these things with 3 doses of a drug versus have somebody take a drug for the rest of their life, of course the pharmaceutical companies are going to push for the ones you take forever and cost a lot of money. So it's definitely a difficult place to be in, but that's why Rick Doblin's so amazing, is he's like fought the fight and he's winning, it's going well.
So MAPS will have, what do they call it? Exclusive use of the way that they synthesize MDMA for like controlled psychiatric therapy for,
I think it was 5 years.
is it just 5? I thought it was longer. It doesn't matter, but they'll have some exclusive use so that they can try to recoup some of the millions and millions and millions of dollars of cost. So they've gone through phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials showing like the effectiveness and safety.
Yeah.
These are multi-center trials that have happened all over the world. So they've had to coordinate researchers and all over the US. A lot of the research has been done in Canada.
Yeah.
We tend to be a little bit more liberal towards these things in Canada, Israel, like all over the world. So just an incredible amount of work that they've done to try to bring this to the world for basically no personal benefit, just because Rick Joblin just believes in this to the core.
Just a good dude.
He's just a good dude.
So let's talk a little bit about like the safety of MDMA, because that's one that like has been in the media before. First of all, MDMA doesn't work if you're already on SSRIs, right? Yeah. SSRIs are regulating the amount of serotonin in your system. And so if you take a drug that releases a surge of it, those SSRIs just won't let it happen. Like it just doesn't work. And so often it's problematic because somebody is on an SSRI and they take some MDMA and it doesn't do anything for them. And so they take more and then they take more and then you just end up getting all the negative effects and none of the positive ones. Yeah. So in the trials, they get people to go off the SSRIs as part of this. Yeah.
Exclusionary criteria is you can't be on an antidepressant.
Other than that, it's generally quite safe as long as you're doing proper dosages. So MDMA is one of the drugs where the street amount that's taken is often much higher than the medical one. Usually MAPS will use 100 to 120 milligrams, and then they'll often do a second dose within the session of half. Whereas some people on the streets are taking like 2 or 3 or more, 100 milligrams. So at smart dosage is quite safe. Safe enough to the point where as part of the MAPS training, they'll have the therapist take it. Not as part of therapy, just as part of experiencing the drug and getting to understand what their patient is going to be feeling and how to better deal with it.
So to be clear, the therapist is not on drugs with the patient, not at the same
separate
time. But to become a MAPS associated therapist that will participate in the trials, they have to do MDMA themselves.
So it's safe enough that they're even willing to have the doctors and the professionals take it.
Because it's not like they make your psychiatrist take Zoloft before you can take Zoloft. That's not a thing. You know?
Yeah. There is some potential for overdose. There's no concrete LD50 for sure, because there's cases of people taking 10 to 20 times the normal amount over the course of a night, taking 2 grams of this stuff and not really dying or having any real bad problems. And then there's other cases of people taking smaller amounts and having super adverse effects. So there is some potential there, but in medicine, most of the bad experiences come from revisiting trauma, not from the drug itself. It's just the fact that they are going through a very difficult process, and that's generally what makes things negative. Otherwise, it's almost all positive. And then as far as street use goes, the most common problems are mixing with other drugs, specifically ones that you don't even know you're taking. Mm-hmm. You might be taking a pill that you think is MDMA and there's actually meth or who knows what else in there.
Or mixing it with the world's most harmful drug, which is
alcohol.
Alcohol
and MDMA together are very bad. Not a great mix. You can completely black out and have no idea what happened all night long. And it just greatly increases the dangers of both drugs. But then the other two big things are overheating and then hyperhydration, not dehydration, but hyperhydration. So what will happen is people will go to a music festival and they'll be in the hot sun, 35 degrees, Coachella, and they're just dancing all day long, and they overheat, and that's where the major problem is. And then often people get really thirsty on MDMA and think they need to drink way more than they do, and they'll hyperhydrate themselves to the point where they'll start to have negative consequences. So again, if you're in a medical setting or you're aware of the problems, potential risks, you can make it very manageable, way less risky than a lot of other substances.
The difference between a rave and the clinic is
very
big.
Different. Yeah.
We talk openly to Atlas about what all these drugs are, what they do, what the effects are, the safety profiles. And we'll do the same with Dash when he gets to be that age.
Yeah.
And the point we always try to emphasize is that these drugs, even though these drugs are quite safe, all drugs that you get from an unknown source are dangerous because they're illegal. Yeah. Because they came from the black market, because you don't know who cooked up what in their bathtub. You don't know what's in them unless you've had them tested and verified. So assume that all drugs are contaminated with fentanyl until proven otherwise.
Yeah. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about kind of summarizing all of this. But basically all of the information we were given in the DARE days is about ecstasy is completely false. It's scare tactics. It's bad science. And they did it strictly to shock people because MDMA came out when the drug war was going strong and it started to gain popularity and they needed some way to scare people into not doing it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those things because they're hilarious.
Yeah.
So Oprah had an episode that you specifically remember watching where they brought this person on and had a scan done of their brain and said they had these gigantic holes in their brain from doing MDMA one time.
I fully remember watching this episode of Oprah with my mom. And yeah, they showed on the screen the scans of the brain, these big dark spots.
Yeah.
And this can happen if you go to a rave even one time. And like, what a fucking joke, because any decent scientist, you don't even have to be a neuroscientist to go, if you had holes like that in your brain, you're dead.
You're dead. Yeah.
This is crazy.
And in all of the MAP studies, because they're doing more research on this than anybody, they've had no evidence of any holes in the brain, right?
No.
So there's no holes in the brain. You would be dead. That's ridiculous.
Absurd. And that is the definition of propaganda.
Yeah. It was absolutely scare tactics and it worked for some people.
Nonsense, non-science, intended to induce fear, intended to change behavior. It's like the ultimate propaganda.
Another thing that they used as part of their research was ridiculous doses of the drug. So this was a rat study. When you take MDMA, most people take around 100 milligrams or so is what you're supposed to take, which works out to be about 1 to maybe 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of your body weight, right? They were giving these rats 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram of their body weight. So 10 times the normal dose, 20 times the normal dose. And they were doing it twice daily for 4 days in a row. It's like, if you were to take any drug at that dose twice daily for 4 days in a row, you're going to have a real bad time.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have some problems. So ridiculously high dosaging, way beyond the normal amount that people should take. Normally when people take MDMA, it's recommended not to take it more than every 3 months. MAPS will do it once a month for 3 months in a row just to kind of keep the time frame closer together and make it more effective. But then they also do that expecting that you're not going to continue to do MDMA, especially monthly. So generally the non-scientific rule of thumb is no more than once every 3 months.
And that's because MDMA stimulates the release of your own neurotransmitters. So you dump your serotonin and your brain needs time to replenish those neurotransmitters. And so that's why it doesn't even work to take MDMA multiple days in a row. It loses its effectiveness because you're out of your stores of neurotransmitters.
And it's not even just that you're releasing the serotonin. It's like if your brain is chronically at a high level of serotonin, it'll be like, okay, we don't need this much anymore. We need to down-regulate the receptors. And so the receptors will start to stop being affected by the MDMA.
Lose their sensitivity.
And then you just basically you can take the drug and nothing happens.
Yeah.
And then here's the best one. So they did a study. This one was on monkeys. The goal was to show how neurotoxic MDMA was. And it did prove how neurotoxic a drug was, but it was not MDMA. Turns out they were accidentally, maybe, using meth instead of MDMA. So they said they did this big study saying MDMA causes severe neurotoxicity, but then it came out afterwards that they were actually using methamphetamine, which does.
Meth, not good for you.
We know that. We acknowledge meth does indeed cause neurotoxicity, but that is not MDMA. Those are two very different things. And the problem was that the study came out and everybody heard about it, but then they later redacted the information because it was false. But nobody heard about that. All they heard was that damage was caused by MDMA and it puts holes in your brains and whatever. It's like, no, meth, yes, meth does. MDMA does not when used safely. So.
And primate research is difficult to do. It's not done that often. And there's a lot of suspicion out there. They're like, how the fuck do you mix up meth, amphetamine, and MDMA? And the researchers were like, oh, we grabbed the wrong vial off the shelf. And they're like, either this is the world's worst lab.
Yep.
In which case, why were you granted the ability to do primate research? Or this was maybe designed on purpose to show some harm, artificially show harm of MDMA.
Yeah.
To get any harm, they had to give these poor monkeys meth.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this is either
science.
The shoddiest science ever done, or it was done on purpose like that. And who knows? No one will ever answer that. But.
Yeah. But now moving forward, all the safety and effectiveness of these drugs is very promising. Again, it's just being smart about it. So MDMA is primarily being used for PTSD therapy right now. That's the main area of research, but there are other alternative things that it's also being experimented with. One of them that's really interesting is they're giving MDMA to the spouse or the family member of the person with PTSD, and then having a therapy session with a therapist as well. So not only does the therapist help the person, the patient, but you can have more open communication between the loved ones, so they can understand each other more and freely talk through things. So there's a ton of potential for that, but then also just like couples therapy in general, because it really does break down your walls and allows you to understand the person more and be more open to communication. And so there's a ton of potential for couples therapy. Rick Doblin's like goal, his long-term goal that he doesn't know if it'll happen or not, but he would love it to be that you could get yourself a license to be able to buy over-the-counter MDMA, proven that you're using it safely and you understand the, risks, and be able to use it as part of your relationship. And just, you don't even need a therapist there. It's just you and your spouse working on your relationship and trying to make a positive impact on it. So pretty interesting. There's some research going into using it for eating disorders and anxiety disorders and a few other areas. So lots of potential in this one as well.
One of the other things that's kind of interesting that ties this back to the war on drugs being a huge, gigantic mistake. And we've really suffered under like 50 years of the dark ages as a result of the war on drugs, and untold millions of people have suffered from lots of different angles, right? So, the good guys, the law enforcement, they were forced to enforce these ridiculous laws, and a lot of them were harmed and suffered in the process. A lot of the people with treatment-resistant PTSD are from the military. So as much as we go back to the 60s and there was the pro-war machine side and the anti-war left, the people that are suffering the PTSD are now the ones participating in these trials using these drugs to heal their trauma from being part of the war machine, So it's really coming full circle. There's a police chief from a police department in the US that's gone through the MAPS training to be a psychedelic therapist. So it's interesting to have the head of a police department is now a psychedelic therapist. So formerly a person that would have been arresting anybody for possessing these drugs is now a very strong advocate of using them and letting them help his people, letting them help the police officers that have PTSD from all of the crazy shit that they see in the line of their work, right? So as much as it was like very divided in the 60s, things are coming back around. So we're coming out of the dark ages. This is like the renaissance of psychedelic therapy, and we're moving forward. And I think we can all like lay down our swords, acknowledge that there are uses. These things are safe, they're effective, and that people need them. There is a strong need for these things to help people, and withholding them from the public has done nothing but harm.
I think you can't just blanket statement drugs are bad, because there are so many different types of drugs. There is a spectrum of drugs out there, right? Caffeine is a drug. Alcohol is a drug. There's all these drugs that people are using, and then they'll like shun anybody who even talks about using other drugs, even if it's for medical usage, right? I thought it was really interesting when marijuana was legalized, right? For the first little while, everybody was kind of like tiptoeing around the subject, right? And then slowly somebody would be like, oh yeah, I like smoked some weed last night, or oh yeah, last night I had an edible. And now it's become more of a like common thing that people talk about. Like, what are you doing tonight? I'm going to get some weed or something like that. And it's funny because you'll be like, how was your night last night? I'd be like, oh man, I got hammered last night. But if you were to say, oh man, I did MDMA last night, you're like, what? It's like shocking. And it's like, we need, like you said, we need to lay down our swords. We need to acknowledge that there are perfectly good uses for these drugs. A lot of them are safer than the ones we're using, sometimes on a daily basis. So we can't just lump them all together. What's funny is some of the most harmful drugs out there are the prescription drugs. Some of the most dangerous drugs are benzos, opioids, and you can get those from a doctor, So when you have a perfectly safe chemical like LSD, but you're completely against anybody using it, even if it's for like helping them deal with their mental issues, like that's a problem. So
I think it's weird that people have, and this is what needs to get broken down. And if this is in your brain, this is the result of dare conditioning propaganda for probably when you were a kid, that there's drugs and alcohol. That's like saying fruit and apples. Like alcohol is a drug. Alcohol is a drug. Anyone that drinks, you do drugs. Alcohol's changes your brain. It just happens to be a drug that you ingest like by drinking it, as opposed to, snorting it or smoking it or swallowing it or any other way of getting it into you. But alcohol's a drug, and alcohol's the worst.
It's one of them. It's
most harmful, most social harm, most addiction potential. And of all the things we decided that was the one that's going to be legal.
Yeah.
And we learned back in the 1920s that prohibition doesn't work.
Yeah.
Prohibition puts the distribution of these things into the hands of the black market. It increases crime. It decreases safety for the user. It increases concentration because of like the problems with shipping, you know, and you moving it around illegally. And it only took 10 years of alcohol prohibition for everyone to go, well, this is stupid.
Yeah.
But for some reason, we've been dealing with 50 years of drug prohibition without going, well, this is stupid.
Yeah.
You know,
I think that the most dangerous drug is the one that you don't know you're taking. Yeah. So when somebody relies on street drugs, they might be buying one thing, but getting something else. Fortunately, we're kind of coming around where there are like testing sites available now and you can like figure out what's actually in your drugs before you take them. But the main problem with the overdose problem is that people are taking what they think is a little bit of heroin and it's actually a teeny bit of heroin with a little bit of fentanyl in there. And it's enough fentanyl to like overdose. So we need to, you know, I'm not saying we need to like completely legalize all drugs, but it's ridiculous to put somebody in prison for doing something that somebody else is just having cocktails on a patio. You know, it's like, those are just different drugs, but you're both consuming a psychoactive substance.
Yeah. We allow a 19-year-old to go into the liquor store and buy enough alcohol to kill themselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, we, for some reason as a society, are okay with that.
Yeah. It's just bonkers. So I think we all need to just relax and acknowledge that there's some use to these substances and we need to go about finding the right way to make use of them safely and just stop being judgy and acknowledge that like people are just going to do drugs. Even if you don't want them to, people are going to do drugs. It's like sex education being abstinence only. It's like, sorry, but that's not going to work. People are still going to have sex. So we need to find the safest way to make these drugs available so that we're not tying up our medical system with people overdosing. We're not tying up the prison system with people that were just trying to get high or have a good time or whatever. And then we need to free up the permission that people can use these for medical value because there's tons of medical value in a lot of these substances.
So the best harm reduction is better education.
Yeah.
And so if you were completely unaware of any of these things, or even if you're only peripherally unaware and you're like, I would like to be a more open-minded, educated person on this topic, here's some of the recommendations we would make. Michael Pollan, the esteemed writer, he wrote books like The Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food, great writer. He wrote a book quite a few years ago now called How to Change Your Mind. And he was really a big part of, you know, he's like a 60-year-old professor in Berkeley, California, you know, whatever, not a raver, wrote a book about psychedelics. And he was kind of the first one where people went, oh, like if somebody in an esteemed position like Michael Pollan can be open to these things, maybe I could be open-minded too.
And it wasn't just about the topic. It was about him doing them, right? Him experimenting with them and seeing what they were like.
And then there's a 4-part documentary on Netflix called How to Change Your Mind. And they did an exploration of each of the major psychedelics. So there's one on LSD is the first one.
Yeah. There's MDMA, I think ayahuasca.
And mescaline.
Yeah.
Is one of them. So that one's super interesting. The book is quite long. It's a good audiobook.
Yeah.
The Netflix documentary is excellent.
Yeah.
Like we talked about the ancient history of psychedelics is The Immortality Key by Brian Murarescu. And he was also on Rogan if you just prefer to listen to conversations. Johann Hari, super interesting dude. He wrote the book Chasing the Scream. And that's all about the history of the war on drugs. And he also wrote another one on depression. It's really, really, really well done.
Super good.
And a great listen. And he's been on several podcasts too, if you just prefer listening.
Yeah.
Rick Doblin.
Anything
Rick does. Love that dude. Yeah. Maps.org is the organization where you can see all the research, their publications. He's been on lots of different podcasts if you just want to listen to him talk. Huberman Lab has done a fair number of things about psychedelics. And Andrew Huberman is a professor of neurobiology at Stanford School of Medicine. And he was saying in one of his recent episodes that he's like, things are changing. He's like, 5 years ago, I would not have been able to talk about doing psychedelics for fear of losing my job as a professor at Stanford. And he's like, this month, like May, he's like, Stanford magazine, the entire issue is about psychedelics.
Yeah.
So things have rapidly changed and where progress is moving forward, even at the kind of uptight institutional level.
Yeah.
Fantastic Fungi. It's a documentary on Netflix. It's not specifically about magic mushrooms, although they do touch on it at the end. It's just sort of about what a neat type of plant material they are and how different it is from any other life form on Earth. It's really beautiful. The imagery of it is really, really well done.
Yeah, they did a great job with that one.
There's a neat guy in there called Paul Stamets featured, who's just like this amazing mushroom expert and just like really passionate about knowing all about different types of mushrooms. And
that one's worth a watch just because it's a super cool movie, and just learning about the mycelium and how mushrooms work in the forest. It's just amazing. But then they do touch on psychedelic mushrooms a little bit as well. So yeah, there's tons, and like there's more and more documentaries coming out all the time on the effects of psychedelics and, you know, the potential. So there's plenty of information out there. I think we all just need to, like, you know, be willing to learn, right?
There's a documentary we just watched recently on YouTube called Magic Medicine that's all about Robin Carhart Harris's study, and it shows the participants and has them discuss their experiences, and it shows their sessions happening at Imperial College London. So that one's neat. There's lots of stuff out there to like see it happening in the real and learn and educate and you know, hopefully be a part of the change you want to see in the world.
So we've done 3 episodes now. This is the most involved topic we've covered, but again, very close to our hearts. So in tying all of this together, I think that it's important to remember that it's not that drugs are the answer, right? No. It's not that you can just take a drug and it'll fix all of your mental health problems. But I think they can be the catalyst to the beginning. You know, often people are so stuck in their ways that they just can't even begin to make the positive change that need to happen. And psychedelics can often be that jumping off point where you learn a new way of possibility and you're motivated to make the change. But the changes are what's important, right? It's all about having the conversations, dealing with your trauma, dealing with your issues, you know, mentally taking care of what's going on in your brain, and then physically as well. Yeah. Which brings us back to like the second episode, right?
Yeah, where we kind of started at putting the systems that all need to be in place for good mental health. So you need the mitochondrial bioenergetics working properly. And that's where Chris Palmer at Harvard and the brain energy theory comes into play. You need the right energy substrate so that the cells can work properly. And then you need the right diet in place for your gut health and for the building blocks, the micro and macronutrients. You need to make all these neurotransmitters, and you need to be able to make serotonin, and you need happy gut bacteria making the proper metabolites that communicate with the brain. And then you need the signaling of those neurotransmitters to work properly. And that's where the psychedelics can fit in, as they can change the signaling between the cells and allow them to make better connections or new connections. And, you know, then you need maybe some neuroplasticity. It's like exercise. That's where it fits in. Exercise elevates something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, that increases neuroplasticity. And, you know, all of these things fit together in a system. So depending where exactly in the system the problem is, that's why the psychedelics can be very effective for some people, but not everybody. But maybe your problem wasn't your thought loops and traumas that you needed to work through. Maybe, you know, the ketogenic diet is super effective, but not for everybody. Maybe the problem wasn't in your mitochondria. Maybe it was somewhere else. And then, you know, a better diet can be very effective for some people, but not for everybody. Maybe the problem was you needed to process your traumas. Like diet wasn't part of it, you know? But I think we have all of these tools available, and I would issue a challenge to say, if there was a person out there that had appropriately worked through their trauma, whether it's through therapy alone or psychedelic assisted therapy, had, you know, worked through their demons, eats a proper human diet full of the nutrients you need, exercises, goes out in the sun, sleeps properly, has good social connections. I feel like if all of those pieces were in place, I would like to meet the person that still has major depression. Yeah. I don't think it exists. Yeah. But, you know, that has done all of the tools. Yeah. You know, no single one of them has 100% efficacy. None of them do. Yeah. But they're all together. That's the beautiful puzzle. All the pieces that can fit together.
Yeah. It's incredible stuff. I'll leave it at saying that where you love nutrition and the whole bioscience type stuff and love to talk about that, I find all things drugs and psychedelics super fascinating as well. I feel like it's just such an amazing thing that such a teeny tiny amount of a chemical can completely change the way your brain is functioning or the way you're seeing things or feeling things or whatever. I just find this stuff interesting. So if anybody ever wants to discuss or ask more questions, I love talking about it. Yeah. I love to nerd out on all the science stuff about it.
Just like I'll talk your head off about nutrition for 87 years, David will talk your head off about neuromodulators for 87 years.
Yeah. So it's just one of those interesting topics that like you can never finish learning, right? There's always more to learn about it. And it's super exciting that it's like hopefully going to be part of the future of where we take mental health. And mental health is a very important topic to us. And, you know, these were some very difficult episodes to do, but we just want to get this information out there and do what we can.
Yeah. So
thanks for being part of the journey.
Thanks for listening. See you in the next one.